In this problem, we want to use the information given about the angle theta, which is that tangent theta equals -3, and that sine of theta is less than 0, to find the exact value of the sine of 2 theta and then the cosine of theta over 2. So I'll start by finding the values of x, y, and r for our angle theta. Since the tangent of theta equals -3, I can say x, y, and r. What are those going to equal? Well, we have a -3, and that's the same thing as -3 over 1. So I'm going to put a 1 for x and a 3 for y. Now the question is it a -1 and a +3, or a +1 and a -3? And you don't know until you look at the sine theta information. Since the sine of theta is less than 0, that means that y has to be negative. And therefore, because the tangent is negative, that means that x has to be positive. So what we're looking at here is something in the fourth quadrant. Y is negative, x is positive. So now that we've identified x and y, I'm going to say x squared plus y squared equals r squared. And I like writing the formula each time because when I'm practicing, that helps to reinforce the formula, and that way you have a habit of how you're doing the problem when you go to take your exam. So I have 1 squared plus -3 squared equals r squared. And so 1 plus 9 equals r squared, which would make r squared 10. And so r equals the square root of 10. And since r is always positive, we don't have to put a plus or minus there. And we get r is the square root of 10. Okay. So now I want to find the sine of 2 theta. I'm going to take out the work that I just did. I'm going to leave the values of x, y, and r, of course, because that was the whole point, was to find out what those are. Okay. So, sine of 2 theta equals, and my formula is, again, just write it, oops, can't talk and write at the same time. That would be 2 times the sine of theta times the cosine of theta. And what do we know about sine and cosine for this angle theta? The sine would be y over r, so that's -3 over the square root of 10. And x is 1 over the square root of 10, because cosine theta is x over r. Now I'll just multiply across the top and multiply across the bottom. 2 times -3 is a -6. Square root of 10 times the square root of 10 is 10. And this gives me a -3/5. And that's the sine of 2 theta. Now I'll find the cosine of theta over 2. And since we're working with the same angle, I'm pretty much set. So what I'm going to do is write down my formula for cosine of theta over 2. And so this would be plus or minus the square root of 1 plus cosine theta all over 2. All right, so looking at this, what did we determine earlier? We determined that theta must be in quadrant 4 because y is negative and x is positive. So if theta is in quadrant 4, then I need to know where is theta over 2. That's my question, because I need to know if the cosine is going to turn out positive or negative. So theta is in quadrant 4, tells me that theta is between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. So I will divide theta by 2, do the same thing to the other sides of the inequality, and 3 pi over 2 divided in half gives me 3 pi over 4. And that's less than theta over 2, which is less than pi. So that tells me that theta over 2 is between pi and 3 pi over 4, or vice versa, between 3 pi over 4 and 4. 3 pi over 4 and pi. And so that means that theta over 2 is in quadrant 2. And if theta over 2 is in quadrant 2, then I know that I should use the negative for my cosine formula, because cosine is negative in quadrant 2. All right, so I have minus the square root of 1 plus, and cosine theta was 1 over the square root of 10. And I take this all and put it over 2. And I can multiply the top and bottom by the square root of 10. That way I don't have complex fractions. And then I have square root of 10 plus 1 over 2 square roots of 10. And I do have a radical in the denominator and radicals under a radical, and really this is fine. I just don't want to have complex fractions, but this is perfectly fine to end with that answer.